our guest.
I will. So, Richard Gilliver is the producer and regular host of the atheist community of Austin's Talk Heathen show. You can find him on TikTok, where he puts out short videos under Skeptic Takeout moniker, and lives on the atheist community of Austin's channel, which he also coordinates. He continues to work on a website that will bring together all the work he does in skepticism and religious studies in one place, and is working on a book about skepticism, a chapter of which today's presentation has largely been based on, as well as having plans for books specifically in the area of religious studies, and also one of my dear friends. So welcome back, Richard. It's for your third appearance. That's exciting. Yay!
Yay! It is. I'm very happy to be back. I don't know why you keep asking me back.
I just like to torture you, really.
I was going to say it's because we love your voice. You have
that too. You're up there with like the Seth Andrew voices of the atheist community online.
I don't consider myself anything like a Seth Andrews type voice at all.
Well, I don't know. I think the results are in. I think last time you were here, everyone agreed that it's good. You've got that good podcast voice, which I have to tell on myself, Richard. I was telling you in the pre-show, I was on your YouTube channel, which is called Skeptic Takeout with Richard Gilliver, but because you speak this strange British dialect of American, and y'all spell things differently sometimes, and I was on there looking at that thinking it said septic takeout for the longest time before I realized, oh no, that's just British English. That is the proper spelling of that word.
Yeah, I started that, I think it was about 4 years ago now. And it wasn't long after, because I'd never even thought about this. And it wasn't long after, it was only a few weeks after that I was being pulled up by everybody about the spelling of it. So it was I'd already done the branding and everything. I wasn't changing it then. So unfortunately was stuck with that.
No, I love it.
I've been looking at it for years. I never made that connection.
I love it. It's great. I mean, it works. It's kind of like a pun. So and that is not the correct spelling of septic either. I was reading it that way because my brain was like not understanding those letters together in that order. You know how they say you can look at like the first and last letter of a word and like your brain just kind of decides what word it is. I was doing that kind of reading. But it was great. I like it. Okay, back on track here, Richard. What are you here to tell us about this evening? I cannot wait, because anytime we have a talk that is going to be related to a book, I get excited, and I'm excited. Yes, okay, I'm a big nerd. Tell us everything.
This talk tonight in particular started when Helen asked me if I wanted to come on and talk about I think it was the New Testament and in general, or the Gospels in general. And I don't really know enough about the Gospels to speak on them. I'm from a religious studies background, but my speciality is Buddhism. I've been studying Buddhism a long time, and Islam after that, and it's only been the last 5 or 6 years so that I've like started looking into Christianity. So I don't consider myself anything like an expert on Christianity at all in any way, shape, or form. So I found that.
Well, next time I'm just going to invite you back. We're going to talk about Buddhism.
I've taught myself into that one, haven't I?
Yes, you did. Yes. I voluntold you.
I had been working on this book, and one of the chapters in the book, one of the latest chapters in the book, is all about the resurrection and like analyzing the resurrection account. The book's about skepticism in general. It's not got many specific kind of religious chapters in it apart from this one. So I thought, maybe we could work that into the talk. So I've largely based this talk on that chapter. And it's not a word for word copy by any means, but it's certainly based on it in a large part. I do want to point out that someone in the chat earlier on, Richard, put the implausibility of the resurrection dead people can stay dead, QED, we can go home now. And I love that. And it might be surprising to some people that is actually, I don't want to go off topic too much, but that is something that I have talked about a lot with people, and the amount of people who argue that point, people who don't realize that near-death experiences aren't people dying. They aren't people being legally dead and coming back from the dead. That has never, ever happened. It's never happened that we know of. It's never been confirmed to be happening. So what we have there is when people have near-death experiences and are revived, they are in the process of dying. And the amount of people who believe in near-death experiences are people actually returning from legal death is astounding. It is one of the most, when I talk to people, whether it be just on social media, whether it be people calling in the shows, when people talk on this subject, they get really, really defensive over the fact that they have this belief that people have died and returned, and they haven't. And just merely pointing that out really seems to get people's backs up, more so than like insulting the religion in some cases. And I find it really strange that it's something that you can find out with literally 2 clicks on the internet. This information is at your fingertips, that nobody has actually been pronounced legally dead and returned from legal death. And when they have, by the way, in every single case, it has been found to be an error on the clinician's part. So the clinician hasn't recorded it properly. And I just find that absolutely astounding. So that's a great, great comment. I tend not to read the comments when I'm on doing things like this, but that was kind of pre-show and it caught my eye. So that was a brilliant, brilliant comment. Anyway, back to back to what I was here to talk about. Don't let me ramble on, Helen. You know what I'm like, so feel free to kick me in the knee and stop me talking at any point.
I'll get out my virtual whip.
So I'm gonna kind of do this in stages, and the first part of it was talking about kind of common arguments that you hear when we talk about the resurrection accounts. So one of the kind of most common things I hear is a dispute about the dates, and I'm gonna kind of build up to what I think is this argument I've never heard before, by the way, against the resurrection, and it's this argument from psychology, which I've kind of developed and which is in my book. That's what the bit about from the book's based on. But I want to go through kind of what we commonly hear first, and some of the disputes that we commonly have with theists when we're arguing about the resurrection. And when I say arguing, let me clarify here, because a lot of people who aren't used to kind of academic arguing think it means, I nearly named names then, I'm not going to do that. It kind of think it means when you listen to these call-in shows and people are literally shouting at each other and going back and forth. I don't mean like that. It's more of a conversation. We have these conversations, and while we have these conversations, that's an argument. That's a philosophical argument. So it's not a case of, I've never had an academic philosophic conversation with one of my peers in religious studies or philosophy, and we've sat there screaming at each other. It doesn't happen. That's not how it works. But when you say to people who aren't used to these things, oh, we had an argument, people kind of think of it like the colloquial use of it. So I don't mean that when I say argument, but some of the common arguments we hear are, the fact that one of them is relating to the poll question, that Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John were written by the respective Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And this isn't the case. This is something that the consensus of scholarship agrees on, that they weren't written. There is a minority of scholars, and I think I might have mentioned this on one of my previous Recovering from Religion talks. There is a minority of scholars that think they were written, And this is a good place to spot when someone is a scholar, an academic scholar, and where they are not an apologist, because apologists like to dress themselves up as scholars a lot. And what you'll find with the kind of, for me, the demarcation line is that an apologist will argue till till the blue in the face, really, about how they are right and everybody else is wrong. Where an academic scholar, one that springs to mind, and I think I've mentioned him before on here, is Luke Timothy Johnson, is a great New Testament scholar, but it does belong to the minority of scholars when it comes to the authorship of the gospel accounts. And when you listen to him speak, he speaks about the consensus of scholarship. And if you hear any presentations by him, he will say, this is what the consensus of scholarship thinks. These are the dates given by the consensus of scholarship. It is not my opinion. I have a different opinion. However, what we're doing, we're teaching this academically, so we're going to go with the consensus of scholarship. That is the mark of an excellent scholar. I completely disagree with him, but it is a mark of an excellent scholar, and that for me is a demarcation line between I don't want to do the gatekeeping thing, but a genuine scholar and one of these religious apologists who comes out and dresses themselves up as scholars. And I will name no names, but I'm sure you all know who I'm talking about, the kind of people who I'm talking about.
Definitely. I love that you brought that up, because I think that's a tactic that a lot of people use, and it's really it's one of those ways of arguing that's basically a logical fallacy. It's this, sometimes an appeal to authority. Well, I have this opinion, I want to make arguments about it. I'm going to go to school and get a degree in X, Y, or Z subject. And then now that I have a letter after my name, I'm right, even though I'm not saying anything that comes out of that branch of scholarship. But I've got a letter after my name. You have to listen to me. But yeah, there's a big difference between someone who went to school and got a degree and is now practicing in that field and is telling us what the scholarly or the academic consensus is, versus someone who went and got a degree and is now doing something completely different and not following with any of the learning that they received, and is not in line with what is happening in the field at this time. So thank you for making that distinction.
No, absolutely. And you've just raised something really important as well, that, when I think, from my experience, I see this most in kind of creation studies or creation. I'm going to use the word and probably get lynched for saying this, but creation science, that field of pseudoscience, which is desperate to legitimize itself. And, they literally send people, fund people to go and get degrees so that they can argue in what they consider is a legitimate basis because they're academically qualified, even though what they're arguing is complete nonsense. But yeah, it's really, really important to, I think one of the things that I try and stress all the time is that being an atheist doesn't make you, a critical thinker. Being a critical thinker doesn't make you right. We have to check ourselves all the time because our brains are, the way we are, the way the brains are wired is essentially to make mistakes. So we have to guard against that constantly. It's a weird flaw in our big human brains that we have. And if you want to find out more about that, go and listen to the last Recovering from Religion talk I did, because we talked about that then. Anyway, back to the dates. The dates given, the kind of general consensus for the dates of the Gospels is that Mark was written around 70 AD. Luke was written somewhere between, I think it was 80 and 110, with possible later revisions. Matthew was 80 to 90, but again with a wider range of 70 to 110. And John was written 70 to 110 AD. So these are kind of the earliest of those dates is 40 years after the alleged death and resurrection of Jesus. So, and when later on in my closing, I'm going to kind of make a comparison to make that point really, really stand out to kind of a modern audience to sit so we can see what that actually means. But when we look at this, it's really, really important to note that when I say that, for example, Mark was written around 70 AD, it's not the case that we have a gospel written by Mark from 70 AD. This is kind of the kind of assessment we make from different kind of analysis of those things, which I'm not an expert in, so I'm not going to go into. But I think the earliest fragments are the middle of the 1st century at the earliest that we have. So when we say that Mark was written around 70 AD, we're not talking that we have a book of Mark from 70 AD. That's not how it works. When we're talking about the resurrection specifically, the earliest mention we've got is outside of the Gospels. It comes from Paul, and it's from somewhere between about 50 and 58 AD. So that being the earliest mention of the resurrection is 20 years after the death of Jesus. So that's really, really important to note again. We have declarations of faith from slightly before that that don't specifically mention the resurrection, but that's the first mention of the kind of resurrection itself. So, how do we go about assessing these things? How do we think that these things came along? How do we think these things processed and developed? Well, it was a process, and I'm going to kind of quote a book that I've put this in the resource list: An Introduction to the New Testament and the Origins of Christianity by D. Burkett from 2002. And he says the stages of the journey from oral traditions to written gospels can be summarized as: number 1, oral traditions; number 2, written collections of miracle stories, parables, and sayings; 3, written proto-gospels, preceding and serving as sources for the gospels; and 4, the canonical gospels that composed from these sources. So we can see, the scholars can see, I say we as if I am one of these scholars. I am not one of these scholars. I want to make that clear. I've just done reading on this subject, as have many other people who are in the field of religious studies. We can see that there is a development here. We don't just have the case where, as I said, we don't have a book of Mark, which is written from a certain year, like we do in modern publishing, where we can say first published in this year. We just don't have that. We have a series of texts, of proto-texts, where we can kind of see the development of these things. And, I'd highly recommend further reading into that. 2 great books. In fact, I'm going to hold some books up to the camera, seeing as I'm talking about them. I think it's I've got them just by happenstance. I happen to have a pile of books next to me. So the one I've just mentioned, by Delbert Burkett, which gives that timeline, is that one there. It's a very lovely cover. I don't know how. Ooh, that's a wonderful little book. But 2 books I do recommend for kind of looking at, as well as that one, for looking at the kind of how these things developed. And these are really interesting. And I've mentioned this on the show before. I'm a one-trick pony. I don't have much to say, but it's all good stuff when I do say it. These are really important because I'm going to show you 2 books now. One is by John Drain, who is a Christian, and quite a hardcore, devout Christian as well. And the other one is by Bart Ehrman, who all the atheists applaud and shout out as if he is the only scholar in the world. He is not. There are legitimate religious scholars who you should go and read. because they are very, very good, and they shouldn't be dismissed just because they're not Bart Ehrman. So these two books, which I'm going to try and hold up side by side if I can. One is by John Drain, who is a Christian. One is by Bart Ehrman. They are both undergraduate books, level books. They're not like the Bart Ehrman one is not one of his popular books, which you can kind of buy. They are both undergraduate books.
Can you hold them up again, Richard? Because I spotlighted you so everybody can see it.
Yeah. That's those two.
And can you tell us the names of them out loud too for the people who are listening to the audio?
Yeah, the John Drain one is called Introducing the New Testament. The Bart Ehrman one is called The New Testament, a historical introduction to the earlier Christian writings. And what's great about these two books is that they largely come to the same conclusions because they are good scholarship and they are working with the same source material. So whereas they differ in style a lot, the conclusions they reach are very much on par with each other. And so, as I said, this is the consensus of scholarship, which has these opinions about these dates and everything, and how these books were formed. I highly, highly recommend books like that. And if you want further reading into that subject, another book which is slightly different, as I'm holding books up, and you've taken the decision to make my face really big, which thanks, Helen, for, by the way. Nobody wants to see that. It's Christian Theology: An Introduction by Alistair McGrath. And this is a really goes into the Trinity and everything, and it's that's a book it was given to me by a vicar friend of mine, and it's a book which is actually recommended to the clergy of the Church of England when they are going on to their university courses and learning about stuff. So that's one of the books they've actually recommended to read. It's a good book. It is very apologetic in places. I will say that, but it is, if you can get past that, it is a good book. There's some interesting statements about faith and things in there. So yeah, they're just a couple of, I've put those in the reading list because I know that Cara likes things in the reading list. So for them, I have
love that.
Yeah, I was going to say, since you were talking about the Gospels, that we could put up the poll questions and then see what people said and how smart our audience is.
Ooh, yes. So,
and even if you got stuff wrong, you're still very smart.
Yes. This is a crowd that likes to read. So I've put the links to those books you mentioned in the chat, and we'll list them again at the end. And in the meantime, here are the poll questions. So the first question we asked was, who wrote the New Testament Gospels? And 8% of people selected Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 23% of people selected all of the above. 15% of people thought it was some of the above. 50% of people here said none of the above, and 28% said, I do not know. So that's a pretty big spread on those, which sounds like, go ahead.
I think it's very important in that as well to note that there are no wrong answers in this. So the way I would answer that poll is by saying I don't know, just if anyone's interested in my opinion on it, because we don't know who wrote them. It's very important. There were actually at least, I can't remember which ones they were, but the first time the Gospels were mentioned that we know of in history is somewhere between 120 and 150 by Justin Martyr. And the first time they were attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John was around 185 by the Bishop Irenaeus. And if you think about, how in kind of church tradition, most people think that Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John wrote those Gospels. And it was 130 years after the death of Jesus that they were first officially attributed to them. And, these when we're talking about history, it's very easy to throw numbers around and just kind of say, oh, it's 130 years. That's a long, long time. If you think about it in the kind of span of your own lifetime, I had a friend who died a couple of years ago. He died in his 90s. He was 93 years old when he died. And me and my best friend used to go and have what we called our little whiskey tea nights together. We used to go, and the three of us used to sit and drink whiskey and just chat and stuff. And he used to tell us all these stories about when he was young. So kind of in the region of about 85 years. And this was some of the stuff he told us. It said he'd never told anybody else before. So me and my best friend were the only two people who were party to this knowledge of this man's life from 80 years before. And it's amazing. That's kind of, if you think about all that lost knowledge that there is out there, it to me, stuff like that blows my mind. So these numbers are big numbers when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to having things. So they were first attributed in around 185. There was a kind of tradition before that they were written by these guys, but when we're talking about when they're first officially attributed, this is important stuff. This is when the church first decided that, yes, we are going to officially say this is the case. Now, what we've also got to bear in mind about the gospel accounts, about all this stuff about Jesus, when we're talking about the resurrection, especially when we're, in the position that I'm in, sometimes, and other people are in who've appeared on your show, is that we have conversations with people. We have call-in shows where people call in and chat to us and talk to us about this stuff, and they will speak as if, there is lots and lots and lots of evidence from history for the resurrection. We've got to bear in mind that when we're talking about extra biblical evidence, and let's be clear about what the Bible is. The Bible is the stuff that is collected together that the church wanted to present as the facts in these situations. So when we're talking about extra biblical evidence, that's stuff which, may have been present that the church didn't want to include. There is none contemporary to Jesus's life. There isn't a single piece of extra biblical contemporary evidence that talks about Jesus's life, that talks about Jesus's death, Jesus's resurrection. There is not one single piece. And when we look at other figures from the time, people like Cleopatra were around 30 years before Jesus. And the amount of evidence we have for them, for Cleopatra, we've got busts that were made, we've got carvings on the side of Egyptian buildings, we've got writings, we've got all this stuff, we've got coins, all this stuff which is contemporary to Cleopatra, the latest Cleopatra, should I say, just to be clear, because I've been pulled up on this before by people who are pedantic and say there were more than one Cleopatra. Everybody knows who I'm talking about. Let's not be silly. We're talking about the last in the line of the Ptolemies. So we've got all this contemporary evidence for this person who was really important. Now, when we're talking about Jesus, essentially what we could say is that we're talking about potentially the most important figure who ever lived. And we have no contemporary evidence for them whatsoever. That's really, really important. It doesn't make sense at all. But, let's I want to move on a bit because I realize I'm dragging these points out rather a lot. And I want to kind of try and get through this as quickly as I can. So, do the gospel accounts match is where I want to kind of go to next, because this is another thing that, we kind of get this idea from Christians when we're having these conversations that, the gospel accounts agree. They agree, they largely agree. And where we see them disagree, these are the kind of small disagreements that we would expect to see. I don't think they are. I don't think they are at all. And because, when we expect to find differences, if we're kind of in a courtroom and we expect to find differences in accounts. What we expect to see is things like, I saw this man robbing this joint and he had an orange sweater on. And another witness will come along and say, no, 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 he had a brown sweater on. And another one will come along and say he had a red sweater on. These are the small, slight changes in detail that we'd expect to find. This is really important because this is one of the biggest defenses that kind of Christians give for the resurrection account, that we'd expect to find these differences. But when we look at the gospel accounts, what we have is only 3 consistencies spread over 4 accounts. The first is that Mary Magdalene was present. The second is that there was an empty tomb. And the third one is that Jesus was alive. And that is in itself tenuous because we're relying on these eyewitnesses to tell us this. So it's really, really important that what we get in these kind of contemporary, these accounts that are next to each other when we do a side-by-side reading, that every other detail of the 4 accounts differ. And this is not just the minor differences that we'd expect to find. This includes the time of day, who was present, what was said, where the events took place. These are all different. These aren't the mild discrepancies that we would expect from reliable accounts. These are differences that in a court of law would undermine a case completely. And so to put that into context, if we put this in a court of law, we'd have one witness saying, it was nighttime and I was on my own and I ran straight away. Witness 2 would say, it was daytime and I was with witness 1 and we went inside and there was a man there. Any prosecution would discount these witnesses as unreliable. And what's more, when we look at the factors that make eyewitness testimony unreliable, several of these play out in the gospel accounts. So it's kind of really, really important that we take that into account as well.
And can I also ask
please
too,
interrupt because my voice is really croaky and dry at the minute.
No, yeah, take a second, grab a drink, because I've got a question on this too. Something that always bothered me, even like as a younger person who believed everything. I grew up, evangelical. We believed the resurrection happened and the Bible was, a true and accurate account of history. But something that always bothered me then, and certainly does now, is that even in the accounts where there are these alleged eyewitnesses that we now know these accounts were written decades, if not, a century or more later, they were saying that even these eyewitnesses who were people who were close to Jesus did not recognize him. They were talking to this person at length, and then at the end of the conversation, he reveals, "Oh, I'm actually Jesus." And they said, "Oh, we didn't recognize you at all." Like, doesn't that seem strange? Like, you're talking about in a court of law, if you're in a court of law and an eyewitness is giving testimony, there's an expectation that they will be able to look at the person and say, "That's the one I mean." But apparently this didn't occur. Do you have any thoughts on that, or what is even going on there? Why is it that none of these people even claimed that they could recognize him as Jesus when they allegedly saw him?
It's bizarre. I mean, there is a field of kind of excuses around this, but I'm not well versed enough to kind of go into it and talk about it. What I can say regarding that in particular is that in Mark's account, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome went to the tomb, and they saw a young man there who told them to go to Galilee and Jesus would meet them. And some people think this young man, some people attribute this man to be an angel, some people think this man was Jesus. And you're right, they don't recognize him. And it's bizarre that you wouldn't recognize someone. And, I'm going to talk about kind of the psychology of trauma in a little bit. So that is, it might be that at play a little bit, but it doesn't really make sense. I'd certainly think that regardless of trauma, and from what I've seen, there's not there's not really anything in the psychological literature which would say that you wouldn't recognize someone in this situation. To my mind, if I was in that situation and someone I deeply cared about, someone who had just lost through a traumatic event, if I saw them again, I would recognize them immediately. I probably wouldn't believe that it was them. I would think I was having some kind of episode and kind of misinterpreting what was going on if I thought they'd to be dead. You know, I lost my father, and you know, I've lost both my mum and my dad. But you know, when I first lost my father, that one was kind of the most traumatic of the two because it was the first parent I'd lost, and I had lots of dreams afterwards where I saw him in my dreams. And my brain, in my dream, was saying to me, this cannot be real because your dad is dead. So this must be some kind of dream. It isn't real. And you know, I was having that narrative, and I think you'd have the same kind of thing in that situation. You wouldn't go along and just not recognize the person. You'd have this kind of struggle going off where you were trying to decide, is this real? Is this not real? That's how I see it anyway. And I'm not a professional in that field at all, so I don't know if that's an accurate representation. But I've of the psychology I've read, I've not seen anything which would kind of indicate that you wouldn't recognize someone, that you'd block somebody out completely who you knew about. But it's an interesting field, and as I said, there are theological kind of reasonings behind why they didn't recognize them, but I'm not well versed enough to talk about them. So, you know, I do recommend you go and have a look at them independently from scholars, not apologists, people.
I had a question on something you said before. So you mentioned something about like when the Gospels are written that one of the arguments is that Jesus was alive. Does that mean like he came back as a like living flesh person, or is it alive after the resurrection? Because it's alive is a quibble word I'm having right now with this particular, I mean, that particular argument.
When we're talking about the resurrection account, you know, he was literally said to have come back to life. So he was considered to be by believing practitioners alive, you know, resurrected fully in body. So it's I don't know where he went when he wasn't alive, where this body went, but it's you know, again and again, that's one of the arguments that Christians give. Where was the body? This is clear evidence that he was resurrected. Otherwise, we'd have the body. It doesn't really make sense to me that there's lots of people in history we don't have the body of. We don't suddenly think that we're all resurrected just because of that. You know, these kind of things are out there. There's lots of arguments back and forwards. You know, and one of the things that is really important in this is that, you know, one thing I try and ask religious people who I'm having this argument with is that what is the criteria which you think is sufficient to attest to the historicity of the supernatural claim, you know, that we find in the resurrection account? So what we tend to get, and I don't want to kind of broad brush everybody because not everybody agrees with these, but this is the kind of general response you get to this, that there are no contemporary, you know, I will ask people, do we agree with these following things? That there are no contemporary extra biblical accounts from any source attesting to the resurrection. We do have later Roman accounts that attest to Christians believing in what is written in the Gospels. For example, Tacitus and Pliny the Younger. Some of them are a little bit dubious, but we do have them. And, you know, we must consider them if we're doing a fair appraisal of it. Before the Gospel accounts were written, the information, as we've already talked about, would have been passed down orally to the authors. And there are authentic, the accounts, the gospel accounts are authentic representations, with the possible exception of Mark verse 16 to 9 onwards, because, that was a later edition of the biblical account. And generally, if you're talking to somebody who's reasonably well versed, who knows the scholarship, you will get, yeah, I agree with all of those things. They are sufficient things to say that, I accept the resurrection account is entirely authentic, that it is evidence of the supernatural claim of the resurrection. So, by that standard, what those people are acknowledging, and this is really, really important, is sufficient criteria to attest not only to the resurrection of Jesus, but the historicity of the supernatural claim that confirms Muhammad split the moon in Surah Al-Qamar 554 1-2. And the supernatural claim that the Buddha flexed his arm and in the blink of an eye transported himself from the Subhaga forest in Okata to the heavenly realm in order to talk to Brahma, whom Mara described as the conqueror, the unconquered, the all-seeing, all-powerful, the sovereign lord, the maker, creator, chief, appointer and ruler, father of all that has been and shall be, is related in the Brahma invitation from the Majjhima Nikaya 49. So the criteria that they have agreed to that make the gospel accounts authentic can be compared to these things. There are no contemporary extra scriptural accounts from any source attesting to these supernatural claims in Islam or Buddhism. We do have later accounts that attest to Muslims and Buddhists believing in what is written in these books. For example, Ibn Abbas, Anas bin Malik, Abdullah bin Masud, Ibn Kathir, Al-Tabari, Asoka, Sengyao, and Dawan, amongst many, many others. Before the accounts were written, the information would have been passed down orally to the authors, and they are authentic representations of the scriptural accounts. So when we take in, when we have these conversations and we present this as a criteria for the belief that the resurrection is a historic account, and they say, yes, this is sufficient criteria, we can point out that criteria also demonstrates that two other contradictory religious traditions are also true, given the criteria that they're using. It's very, very important to kind of note these things.
That's a really good point. I know I hear that a lot from people who are emotionally invested in trying to reconvert me back to Christianity. In other words, family members. That, oh, but there's so much evidence, the eyewitness accounts, and it's written in these texts that have remained with us for however many hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. And the eyewitness accounts, you can't discount the eyewitness accounts. This is all we have. This is how all history is done, et cetera, et cetera. And I think you're making a really great point here that, oh, really? So if that's the only criteria that we're going by, that a book that you read claims that people saw something happen, then we must believe that it's true. Well, then we have to believe pretty much all of the holy texts throughout history and all of the claims that they make, if we're not going to rely on any kind of other external evidence. Is that basically it?
Yeah, and I think it's a great specifically for this particular event is a great example to use. I think in general it's a good example to use. Well, I see quite a lot of Christians complaining that we kind of, well, they keep bringing up other religions as though that's some kind of argument. I think it's a really, really good basic argument to ask the question when somebody says God said this or God did this, just to say which God. And I've made a video about this, and I think it's because I think it's so important to ask which God. And it might seem pithy, it might seem like a pedantic thing. We know full well which God a Christian is talking about when they are mentioning this, but it's an important point to make, to get them thinking, which God is it we're actually talking about? Not only which God, but which interpretation of the Christian God are we talking about? Because there are many, many different ones. This is another thing which is totally bypassed by a lot of Christians, is that there are a lot of legitimate different theologies, even within Orthodox Christianities, and that's not even considering the stuff which isn't considered Orthodox, where it gets even watered down even more still. When you look over the first kind of 7 ecumenical councils, and the reason I mentioned the first 7 and not any more than or less than that is because I've got a book called The First 7 Ecumenical Councils, which is really interesting because it actually gives you the information from them. So I'm familiar with those more than anything else. It's that you see how complex I am. I read a book and then I repeat the stuff from the book. Not as an authority, by the way. But, when we look at the first 7 ecumenical councils, and we look at the theologies which are being argued in those things, and, the kind of the bishops who were getting excommunicated because they don't have the right beliefs, and it's really interesting. It's a great melting pot. And again, when like when I was talking about the kind of the progression of the Gospels, how they started off as oral traditions, etc., and then became this final thing, we can see that in the theology, in kind of Orthodox theology, how we have these different ideas, how things like the idea of heaven wasn't a biblical idea. The kind of modern idea that Christians have, that we go to heaven, didn't come from the Bible. It came from Plato. And it was because a lot of these kind of early church fathers, these bishops who were arguing about these things, were getting really into Greek thought and Greek philosophy. So they were pulling things from Platonism. And, this goes to such an extent that, the idea that we go to heaven is a Platonic concept, but the original Platonic concept in full was that the soul comes down from heaven, is implanted into a body, and when it dies goes back to heaven, and then that process repeats into another body. There were some of the early church bishops who believed this, that there was this kind of idea of reincarnation that went on. In that was a legitimate consideration in early church theology, to the extent that one bishop, and I forget his name, and I always forget his name when it comes to saying this, and I really need to write it down on the back of my hand every time I have these conversations so I don't forget it, had this idea that this process went on so long that he thought that at one point in the future, Jesus and the devil would come back down into bodies, but their roles would be reversed. He was quickly excommunicated. But it was a legitimate consideration, and there's lots of these things when you look at the development of theology in the early church, where you get what we consider now with the kind of modern form of Christianity broad brush statement that we kind of accept. There was a lot of these concepts that we thought would be completely alien to us now with serious considerations. And that's what these ecumenical councils were for. They were to iron out these differences. And that's where we get the concept of the Trinity coming into fruition based on earlier ideas. We get like proto-Christian groups who weren't involved in the ecumenical councils, like the Essenes, I think, were one of them, who thought that, the kingdom of heaven was within us, and there were these the universe was made up of spheres, and within these spheres the angels lived, and things like that. And you have all these really great interesting theologies which were going off in the early church. And what when we say that we have Orthodox Christianity, all that we mean by that is that we got these bishops coming together, and the ones that agreed with each other said that the ones who were slightly on the fringes were no longer part of their group. That's essentially what we mean when we say Orthodox Christianity, and then it goes down, it rolls down the hill, and it rolls down the hill, and it becomes tradition, then it becomes truth, capital T, in the minds of the Christians who believe it, and then it's always been this way. And I find it fascinating that, when I was talking about the Christian theology book my friend gave me, that the people, certainly in the Church of England, and maybe not in your backstreet Kansas church where the preacher's learned from his dad and he's learned from his dad, but certainly in the Church of England, you get these kind of academic people who are going to university who are learning this theology, and they're still coming out the other side saying, yeah, I still believe in that. And that fascinates me because they're being given the information. The whole thing about the Holy Spirit being part of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit, I'm getting way off point here, but the Holy Spirit, I get really excited when I start talking about this stuff.
I love it. Keep going. This is how my brain works too.
Yeah.
The Holy Spirit was first kind of this idea that it was this fire of inspiration that came from heaven. It wasn't part of the Trinity originally. It was this fire of inspiration. And in the early church, it was it came down and it entered into the bishops, and they were compelled to speak. And this is where the idea of speaking in tongues kind of traces back to, but they were compelled to speak. And they had to put something in place to stop it being kind of seen in this spirit, because there was this one particular bishop who started speaking with this compulsion from the Holy Spirit. But it was all this really weird, dodgy stuff that the other people didn't agree with. So they put this rule in place. They put a rule in place to say, right, we're no longer accepting the Holy Spirit as being this thing that comes down from the heavens and enters you and gives you this compulsion to speak, because we can't have the Holy Spirit saying things that is not part of what we think, that is not orthodox. So what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of that idea of the Holy Spirit, and we're going to kind of slowly progress it into this other thing. And then it became part of the Trinity as this kind of aspect of the Godhead. It's all interesting stuff, which I get too far too giddy about. Shall we talk about the psychology of the resurrection?
Yes, we made it.
Yes,
we looked at one poll question.
Yes, before we go to that. Yes. Okay.
So let's move on to number 2, and then we'll get part 2 of this lecture.
Yes, I will read the other poll results quickly. The second question, I think we've already heard the answer to. It was which of the Gospels was written first, and I believe a majority or a plurality of people got it correct. It is Mark, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well done. 45% of people said Mark. 30% of people were not sure. And some other choices were chosen as well. So, okay. Some people have read some of the texts on this before getting here, apparently. That was interesting. And then I'll go real quick. We do. The most important question. Yes, the most important question. Zoom is telling me it sounds like I have switched to a different language and wants to know what language I'm speaking. It's still English. Sorry if I've confused anyone with my strange accent. Okay, still going here. So hopefully I am understandable. The final question is, which of the following is not a Ben and Jerry's ice cream flavor? And we were all over the place on this one. 6% of people selected Caramel Sutra, or caramel, depending on where you're from or what language you're speaking at the moment. 17% picked Netflix and chilled. 6% picked Oat of the Swirled. 26% picked Land of Milk and Honey. 14% picked bovinity, divinity, and 31% think this is a trick and it's none of the above. Well, guess what, Helen? Which one was not a real Ben & Jerry's ice cream flavor?
It is Land of Milk and Honey.
So. Yeah, the others are all real flavors. So there you go. Oh, I forgot to actually hit share results again. There are the share results.
Yeah, we didn't do that. So yeah.
Yes.
I realized that just at the same place that you did.
We share a brain
let's go into the psychology.
Yes, let's hear it.
Okay, so this relates largely to the eyewitness accounts. And I think, you know, I've touched upon it briefly a little bit, but I'm going to go into it in a little bit more detail now. So we know that eyewitness testimony is unreliable. You know, the multiple, you two are the psychology people. So if I say anything wrong in this, please pull me up. This is my understanding of it as a psychology isn't my field. So do pull me up if I say anything wrong. We know that eyewitness testimony is unreliable. Multiple studies have shown this. We know that several factors are at play making eyewitness testimony unreliable, including the misinformation effect, and that's where misinformation can lead to a false memory. And I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail in a bit. I'm just going to throw lots of papers at you, by the way, here. So just to kind of give examples of what I'm talking about. So misinformation effect, there's papers by Frender, Nichols and Loftus from 2011, Loftus 2005, Bartlett and Meemum 2007, Cece and Brooke 1995. Poor vision or viewing conditions, stressful experiences, time factors, delay between the action and the recounting, collusion and memory biases, and that can be found in papers from Brown 1991, Alber and Hasher 1983, memory distortion in traumatic events, Strange and Takarange 2012, and again in 2015. False memories, Loftus and Ketchum 1994, Heaps and Nash 1995, Seaman, Philbin and Harrison 2006. And what's more, we can identify multiple of these things at work in the gospel accounts. We also know that mistaken eyewitness identifications contributed to approximately 69% of the more than 375 wrongful convictions in the United States, which were overturned by post-conviction DNA evidence, and that comes from the Innocence Project. What we usually find from apologists is the claim that there are multiple eyewitnesses in the gospel accounts, and that this specifically makes the case stronger, and that we should expect to find discrepancies within multiple eyewitness accounts. I've already touched on the kind of discrepancies part, but I want to talk about whether multiple eyewitnesses are better. In an article in the Journal for Applied Research in Memory and Cognition, which was 2019, by Crystal R. Slane and Chad S. Dodson, it states that two eyewitnesses who mention different features are less persuasive than two eyewitnesses who mention the same feature. This is very important to the Jesus case, because we know from the gospel accounts that some doubted, as in Matt 28:17, that he appeared in a different form to some, which is in Mark 16:12, which we've already talked about. And he wasn't recognized at all by others. And that comes in Luke 24:16 and John 20:14, which we've also talked about. In every gospel account, we have an example of why the multiple eyewitnesses argument doesn't add weight to the claim. In fact, as the article states, it makes it less persuasive. And I want to go into a bit more detail in some of these things. So the misinformation effect. I've taken this from the Frender, Nichols and Loftus paper from 2011. This was called Current Issues and Advances in Misinformation Research, and it was published in Current Directions in Psychological Science. So the authors review a case where 25 people died when a Metrolink commuter train collided with a Union Pacific freight train. It was near Los Angeles in September of 2008. And the paper reads, after an extensive investigation, the authorities decided the eyewitnesses were wrong. The signal was read and the engineer's text messaging was a major contributor to the accident. Is it possible, it asks, that 4 eyewitnesses, including a conductor, a security guard, and 2 railroad enthusiasts, were all mistaken about such a crucial detail? The answer is yes. Eyewitnesses make mistakes. Multiple eyewitnesses can all be wrong, and their erroneous testimony can have enormous consequences. The paper goes on to state that in the wake of more than 30 years of research, an ever-growing literature continues to demonstrate the distorting effects of misleading post-event information on memory for words, faces, and details of witnessed events. And it also says that nobody is immune to the distorting effect of misinformation. On the same subject, a paper from Loftus in 2005 entitled Planting Misinformation in the Human Mind, a 30-year investigation of the malleability of memory. It was published in Learning and Memory. This paper states, so what do we know about the misinformation effect after 30 years? The degree of distortion in memory observed in the Ocado and Stark neuroimaging study has been found in hundreds of studies involving a wide variety of materials. People have recalled non-existent objects such as broken glass. They have been misled into remembering a yield sign as a stop sign, hammers as screwdrivers, and even something large like a barn that was not part of the bucolic landscape which an automobile happened to be driving. One very interesting thing that this paper alludes to is to the trope that we often hear from Christian believers who confidently state, would people die for a lie? Well, the paper addresses this very simply. It says misinformation can even lead people to have very rich false memories. Once embraced, people can express these false memories with confidence and detail. In short, we don't have to make the judgment that the followers of Jesus died for a lie. We can confidently state that they could very well have believed it to be true and been mistaken. We also have something else that is very, very important, and which relates to the gospel accounts when we come to kind of, as I brought up earlier, traumatic events and memory distortion within traumatic events. From a paper by Strange and Takarangi, I've probably said that wrong, I apologize. 2012, is called False Memories for Missing Aspects of Traumatic Events, which was published in Acta Psychologica. I've put these specific papers in the reading list if anybody's interested in reading the papers in full, by the way.
And I dropped them in the chat as well, so links are available.
The authors state in this paper, generally speaking, there are at least 2 reasons to believe that memory distortion may play a role in the development and maintenance of PTSD symptoms. First, research shows that victims of traumatic experiences do not always remember the event consistently or accurately. Second, we know that the qualitative characteristics of a negative memory can change over time in response to social influences. In another paper by the same author called Memory Distortion for Traumatic Events, the Role of Mental Imagery, this was published in Frontiers in Psychiatry in 2015, the authors state, and again I stress that this is very important in the resurrection case because we can grant that Jesus was crucified, and this still gives us significant basis to doubt that he was resurrected. So the paper states that trauma memories, like all memories, are malleable and prone to distortion. Indeed, there is growing evidence from both field and lab-based studies to suggest that the memory distortion follows a particular pattern. Our own research suggests that the likely mechanism underlying that distortion is a failure in people's source monitoring. After a traumatic experience, intentional remembering, effortful retrieval, and unintentional remembering, intrusive mental imagery, can introduce new details that over time assimilate into a person's memory for the event. We believe that understanding the role these factors play in distorting people's memories for traumatic experiences is both theoretically and practically important. How much more important can we get than the faith of millions being based on the false recollection of those close to Jesus being due to witnessing the trauma of his crucifixion? The authors continue in this paper. Several lines of converging evidence now document that people are susceptible to memory distortion for experiences of trauma. I think these are very, very powerful arguments against accepting the resurrection. I think even, I've framed this whole thing. Remember talking about framing, Carl, last time? I framed this whole thing in such a way that before I got to this important part about the psychology, we had a look at some of the common arguments, some of the disputed claims that we often hear. As a call show host, some of the calls I take, we often talk about, whether the gospel authors were Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, the kind of historical claims. When we look at this, when we have a look at this, when we use this psychological argument, we can grant all of that. We can say straight up that Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels. We can say they were, very close to the time that Jesus was allegedly died and resurrected. We can say we accept fully that these were accurate representations of eyewitness accounts. And we still have a fantastic reason to say, I do not accept the resurrection, because those eyewitnesses, we know in virtually every aspect of what we are told they witness, are prone to this psychological illusion, this psychological trauma, and cannot be trusted to be recounting details correctly. And I think it's very important to also note that when we're talking about this, when we're talking about eyewitness testimony, we're not talking about, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John being eyewitnesses. That's not what we're talking about. That's not what the Gospels are. Even if we grant that, they were there and they personally talked to Mary Magdalene, and these other witnesses, eyewitnesses who were there. Even if we grant all of that, what we've got is essentially a newspaper report, because it wasn't Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John who witnessed the resurrection. It was Mary Magdalene and the other Mary and the other people who were there, depending on what gospel account you're reading. This series of people who were there and witnessed this thing. It was those people. So what we're essentially doing, if we grant everything, is saying, look, we have this newspaper report which says that these people witnessed this thing, and we can grant everything that the Christian asks for, and we still have a good case against them because of this psychological analysis. Now, before I make my kind of closing statement on this, there's something that I think is very important to kind of mention, and this kind of will serve as a conclusion and a caveat as well. So it must be noted, and we would frankly be poor skeptics if we didn't note this, that there is controversy in traumatic memory research, and that it is, just because we know false memories can occur, it doesn't mean that all traumatic memories are false. And I note this because it's vitally important to recognize where our own biases might be at play. And this doesn't, and this must be stated strongly, diminish that what we know about psychology gives us more than sufficient reason to doubt the testimony of the witnesses to the resurrection. This case would be thrown out of court. And that is in addition to the fact that even accepting them as eyewitnesses is granting that they were real people who witnessed a real event, which relies on taking what are essentially newspaper reports that were written a minimum of 40 years after the event is as accurate. And that's granting a best case scenario. And I want to finish by, and I alluded to this earlier, I want to finish by putting this into context. Imagine, if you will, that's like having no knowledge of the Chernobyl disaster at all. No physical evidence, no reports from the time, literally no knowledge of it whatsoever. And between now, 2024, and the year 2064, 4 newspaper reports coming out that claim to have eyewitnesses from the event, but with nothing corroborating those eyewitnesses actually exist. 1 newspaper copies directly from the first, 1 that is influenced by the first 2, and 1 that is aware of the other 3, who all tell different stories about the event, and coming to the conclusion that that evidence is sufficient to believe that the Chernobyl event happened. Oh, and by the way, it was ghosts that caused it. This is the ludicrousy of believing the resurrection account and claiming that the Gospels are evidence. It is, frankly, ridiculous. And I think any reasonable person, given that scenario about Chernobyl, would dismiss it. And I have to wonder to myself, why don't the religious people dismiss that claim as well? And therein I conclude this presentation.
That was a great conclusion, and you are
that
right
was really
on
good.
time. See, this is why we keep inviting you back.
You stay on track. You have very concise points.
I cannot be accused of staying on track,
You
Helen.
ramble on the things that get your brain activated. So that's awesome. So that's what, and you're going to come back and talk about Buddhism next time. So that's decided.
It's been decided. This is happening. Yep. You heard the prophecy here first. Now, when it comes true,
everybody, I'm going to make a prophecy that Richard, and some sign before 2024 ends, we'll come back and do a talk on Buddhism.
Mark your calendars.
May the Lord strike me down if I'm wrong, or it might be a scheduling conflict.
I don't think you're in much danger in any event. Okay, well, let's go to Q&A. Oh, but first, I am going to put your link tree in the chat, Richard, so people can find Skeptic Takeout, and it is spelled with a C. Because that is, I am given to understand the correct way of writing that word in English, depending on which side of the pond you're from.
If you were going to go into a Skeptic restaurant and get takeout, what would you get at a Skeptic takeout restaurant?
This all started, there's actually a story behind that name. I don't know if any of you remember, Helen might do. I don't know if any, I don't know if anybody else is interested enough to follow anything I've ever done. But I had a podcast with a guy called Richard Gill and Laura McGee called Skeptic Hangout. Now, before this came along, this was about 4 years ago. Before this came along, I was kind of, I'd come out of a long time of talking to religious people in real life and just, the old-fashioned message boards and that kind of thing. And I'd kind of stepped away. I'd got married. I'd stepped away from kind of the skepticism stuff and thrown myself headlong into religious studies. So I was really, and I'd kind of stopped talking. I'd fallen out with the skeptic community in Britain because at the time, all I was hearing was regurgitated arguments and things about the flying spaghetti monster, which I still have a traumatic response to every time I hear about the flying spaghetti monster, because there was so many people using that argument at the time. So I kind of stepped away from the skeptic community and just threw myself headlong into the religious stuff. And then I was watching YouTube and I came across Matt Dillahunty on the Atheist Experience, and it kind of reignited me interested in getting back in touch with the skeptic community, because I thought, this guy is saying the stuff I am saying and I was saying, which is different to what the British skeptic community was saying, which was just largely regurgitated arguments. You know, I thought, here's a guy who can think for himself, and I'm really impressed by that. So I kind of got into that, and I started watching a lot of kind of atheist and skeptic content, and I saw a couple of young or new channels coming up. One was by Laura McGee and one was by Richard Gill. And I thought, I need to contact these people. And my initial idea behind doing anything kind of online was to on YouTube, as a YouTube kind of educator, was to kind of have an in-person kind of discussion. So Richard Gill didn't live that far from me. He lives about 30 or 40 miles away. So I thought, this is feasible, where we can get together and talk about issues around skepticism, talk about these subjects. And wouldn't it be interesting if we did it while eating different takeaway meals and reviewing the meals at the same time as we were having these conversations? And that's where the name Skeptic Takeout came from, because I was literally thinking about getting takeaways in to eat and reviewing the food while having these conversations about skepticism. So that's where the name came from, and that ended up never coming to fruition, but I'd already chosen the name then, so I was just stuck with it because I'm lazy.
I love it. I love it. And I'm now too. Also like we're getting lots of conversation in the chat now about different spellings and puns and different ways of saying things. You know, English is hard and we have too many versions of it.
And listen, English serves us.
Yes, words serve us. We do not serve
we can
them.
Make
we make
up
them
our
do
own
what
words.
we want them to. That is how we got all of them.
That's right.
I love
words
it.
Are made, okay, the words are made up and the points don't matter.
Correct. And speaking of more words, let's hear more words. We have questions for Richard. Let's see. Are you ready for questions?
Yeah, let's dive
in.
All
right. Okay, so first one up, we have someone is asking, I am aware of what is considered the Q source. Has anyone considered the book of Matthew that source? Do you know what this question is about, or what the Q source is?
Yeah, the Q source is, I don't know if anyone's considered Matthew to be the Q source. Not to my knowledge. But the Q source is, so we have Mark, and Mark was the first one that was written. Now, I get these wrong, so I might be wrong slightly in the information I give you, so bear that in mind. The next two were Luke and Matthew. Now, I think, please someone correct me if I'm wrong here, it was Luke that largely borrowed from Mark, and in a lot of cases kind of went word for word from the Gospel of Mark. And Matthew was kind of contemporary to Luke, but wasn't a word-for-word copy. It was slightly different. But both Matthew and Mark appeared to contain information which came from a similar source. Now, we don't have that source. So it's been kind of labeled the Q document. It's this possible source for these two things. And, you know, as I was talking about earlier, we have this kind of lineage, this tradition of how we think the Gospels came about, first as oral traditions, then as proto-Gospels. It's one of these proto-Gospels which the Q source is believed to be. It's nobody's ever found it. It's believed to exist through inference, because we have these other two gospel accounts which are independent of each other but appear to be borrowing from a single source. So that's where the Q source document comes from.
Okay, good to know. That sounds like a really interesting study, and I bet there's a Bart Ehrman book in there somewhere.
There will definitely be a Bart Ehrman book. On that. In fact, I think, and I've mentioned these, both the John Drain and Bart Ehrman undergraduate books. That is, the Q source is mentioned in both of those books.
Ah, okay. I'm definitely marking both of those. You know the key to my heart. It's not good food, it's good book recommendations, and you're gonna have to keep coming back because you are adding to my Goodreads
Oh, wait till we
reading
get on
list.
Buddhism. You're
How
gonna have
much
a
of your
whole
Goodreads
new
have you
world
got
open
through,
up.
Kara?
It is growing much faster than I am able to attack it. So it's just getting longer and longer and longer. I will never catch up, and I'm okay with that. I love it though. Okay. What other questions do we have, Helen? Do you want to pick one?
Somebody was asking, somebody said, I thought that the first gospel,
The first
the
gobble.
first gospel has no sign of a risen Jesus, that it was just an empty tomb. Is that correct?
I'm not sure. Is the answer to that? Let me have a look, because I've actually got the 4 gospel account conveniently. Got the 4 gospel accounts written down here. So
see, this is what happened with someone that studies big brain stuff, like the resurrection on an academic level.
Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene. This is from Mark. This is Mark 9. Now, when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him, as they mourned and wept. But when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe. So no, Jesus did appear, and she did recognize him in Mark.
I think this one might have been asking about Matthew.
Right, okay.
Does Matthew have a different
Let's have
version?
a look what Matthew says. If we can find Matthew, just bear with me.
While you're looking, I have to go get my dog out of the bathroom trash can.
Sorry, I know this doesn't make for interesting viewing, me scrolling through my thing.
We have a snow out of the bathroom trash can. That's good to know.
It appears that I have. Oh, here we go, Matthew.
And dog is better than God. So
the dog is better than God.
Correct. Okay, we're safe. The trash is safe.
Oh no, sorry, safe. I was just reading from Matthew. That was the one I was just reading from.
Oh, okay.
Let's have a look what Mark says.
Like, I never really thought about that, because I guess like my Catholic upbringing didn't give me.
No, I'm wrong. Just sorry.
Oh, it's not.
Matthew says. Let's read it out. So Matthew, this is the resurrection account, 28. Matthew 28 says, now after the Sabbath, towards the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb, and behold, there must always be a behold in there. Makes it very important. There was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes white as snow. And for fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men. But the angel said to the woman, do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he is risen, as he said. Come, see the place where he lay. So yeah, it didn't appear to them bodily in Matthew. You are correct. The questioner is correct.
There we go. I think the questioner on that one was Rob, so I am not surprised to find that it was correct.
Yeah, I apologize for my mix-up then. It's just the way I've got these laid out on this page. It's
Yeah, Richard, thank you. My understanding was essentially that the accounts got more and more elaborate because they weren't believable enough. Like the first one, yeah, he raised, he's not here, but he's somewhere. And then the next one, oh, now he appears to these people, and then he's living with them, and he could stick your fingers in his hole. So it was like got more and more elaborate to convince more and more people that this had happened.
Yeah, it's very important to consider as well that, you know, each of these, you know, we think that these, you know, each of these authors had their own agendas in this. And one of Matthew's agendas was to really, really fit Jesus into prophecy. So when you read through the Gospel of Matthew, is constantly referring back to the lineages of the Old Testament, to the prophecies of the Old Testament. He's desperate to kind of fit Jesus into these ideas from the Old Testament to get him to fit this character of this coming Messiah, which isn't necessarily present in Mark, which is interesting. That's also a great way of, like, there's lots of way of reading the Bible. And, you know, I'm always amused when we kind of, you know, I'm having these conversations, and this is not just theists, this is by atheists as well. When you kind of get these people who say, well, the Bible means this, or, you know, the Bible says this, you know, you often get the blanket statement from atheists that, well, the Bible's just fiction. That's not true, I'm afraid to say. Some of the events in the Bible we do know happened. They may not be accurately recorded, but they happened. You know, the Bible contains lots of different styles of writing, and you've got to take this into account. And very, very importantly, there are lots of legitimate ways to read the Bible, and reading them as a believer is a legitimate way to read it. You know, you can read it as a believer, you can read it as a historian, you can read it as a textual analyst, you can read it in, you know, as a skeptic, legitimately. You can read it as someone who's interested in kind of anthropology. There's lots of different ways to read the Bible. They are all legitimate ways. Now, what I tend to do, what I try and do, not being an expert in many of these fields, never mind all of them, is I try and get as full a picture as possible. So read it, understanding the context of what the believers think. You don't have to agree with them, but understand and try your best to understand it. Don't just go in there and say, well, I disagree with you, therefore you're wrong. Look at the context from which they believe in it. Look at we had a caller to Talk Heathen on Sunday who was talking to the hosts, and I think it was Jamie the Blind Limey and Christy Powell who were hosting. And the first caller was talking about, it was insisting on the definition of the words, some of the words in Genesis. And I'm afraid to say that he was completely wrong. Context is really, really important. It's really, really important. And if you want to talk about the sort of prescription in Numbers, this kind of thing that you know, that induced this abortion, that was present in Numbers, and is heavily argued by people, because atheists love to use it as an argument to say, well, God thought abortion was okay. And Christians love to come back with, well, it didn't really mean abortion, it means something else. It wasn't really the stomach it was referring to, it was the thigh. Guess what, people? There's been research papers written on this. You can go and have a look at what the experts' opinions are on it and analyze the stuff and look at things in context. It's very important to do so. It doesn't matter what I think or Joe Blogs Christian thinks. It doesn't matter what the expert thinks. It matters about the true context and what we can deduce from the information we have. That's a very important part, and to do this in the best way possible is to understand as many contexts as possible. You know, look at the historicity. I forgot the guy's name. The Atheist Handbook of the Old Testament, Josh Bowen. Uh, you know, those are great books. Those and Israel Finkelstein's The Bible Unearthed, really, really good books for talking about the kind of the context of some of these Old Testament cities like Tyre and things like that, and some of the analysis that, you know, the Bible says that some places were burnt by fire, you know, destroyed by fire. And in fact, in some of the cities in the Old Testament that these referred to in the Bible, we find evidence of that. It's not good skepticism to go along and say, because I disagree with you, because I disagree these things are true, the supernatural elements are true, then the Bible is all completely fake, because it's not the case. One of my favorite examples of people getting things awfully wrong, but it being kind of good as a good as argument to that something happened. And Cara, the anthropologists will like this one. Is that you know, we get Christians sometimes who will come along and say, look, when we've got Sodom and Gomorrah and they have found sulfur balls there. This is evidence that God rained down fire on Sodom and Gomorrah. And indeed, it is evidence that that story has a basis in truth. That is evidence of that thing, but it is not evidence that God rained down fire. And if in fact you have a look at what the kind of the scientists who investigate this site say, what they say is it was most likely a meteor strike that caused these sulfur balls to be there. So there's an element.
But what caused the meteor strike, Richard?
Well,
it might have been God.
But this is not the conclusion that's reached by the experts, and this is what's really important. And this is a really good point to take away when we're analyzing this stuff, is that very, very often, and it doesn't, I'm not, you know, this whole thing's been about Christianity, but this applies to all religious folks and just people who believe in the supernatural in general, that people are very quick to point out things that seem to agree with their conclusion. But they're also equally as quick to put a stop in it when that analysis shows that it's something other than their preferred explanation. And we see this a lot in things. But that is a great example of that happening. You know, we see all the time when you get these Christians who talk about those sulfur balls are evidence of Sodom and Gomorrah, and then they stop. They've done enough research to know that those sulfur balls are evidence of an event. But in all that research which is available, it then goes on to conclude that it wasn't, in fact, God who did it, but it was a meteor strike. That's a preferred explanation. But they dismiss that part because it doesn't fit in with the narrative. And, you know, it's easy to pick on religious people and say they shouldn't be doing that. But we should also guard ourselves against that, because we are equally prone to doing that ourselves. As skeptics, as atheists, we are equally prone to saying, well, the Bible's all made up, it's all fiction. And we are wrong in doing that. We have to look at context, and we have to look at what we can conclude reasonably and say, we have enough evidence to say this, but we can't say this. And that is something that, you know, we could learn from. And the amount of people I see arguing religious people on, I probably do too much of it. I probably look online too much, but that's because I'm trying to garner calls for the shows as a producer of Talk Heathen. So I go into these spaces a lot, and I'm not going to lie, I do get pulled into it a lot of the time. But the amount of time I see atheists and skeptics arguing with religious people, and the kind of going full battalion style, battering them down with these, what they consider logical arguments, but they're making the same mistakes themselves that they're accusing other people of making. It's like, just stop. Please just stop and it doesn't have to be. I mentioned at the top of this show that an argument isn't this kind of firing off at each other. An argument should be measured, balanced, discourse which has been thought about, and you've considered your opinion as well as the opinion of the person you're talking to make sure that the things you're presenting are as accurate as possible. Wherever I'm not sure, where we've just had the example about the Q document. I've got a rough idea of what the Q document is, but I'm not sure of the details. I prefaced that answer with, I am not sure. Please correct me if I am wrong. That is so very, very important, and it's something I don't see anywhere near enough of.
Yeah,
I'm going to shut up now.
That's a really great point. And this is one of the several things that I appreciate about how you present information. And this is why we keep asking you back, is the intellectual honesty and being able to say sometimes, well, I don't know, or I can answer this partially. Here's the piece that we do know, and here's the part that I'm not able to comment on. Can someone correct me? Or we don't know at this time. Like, this is being intellectually honest. I agree with your assessment there about this is how skeptical thinking should go, not let me leap to my conclusion and only present the things that pertain to that's not what we want to do here. So thank you for pointing that out. And we've got to wrap up now, but I do want to just quickly touch on, and I mean like real quick, someone has asked a very prescient question in the chat about whether you might have any books coming out about these topics soon.
Yeah,
can we expect anything? No pressure.
I am in the I'd say in the middle of. It's probably more at the beginning of, if I'm honest, of writing a book. I've probably written about 3 chapters of it so far, give or take.
Hey, it's more than chapters I ever written of a book, so you are ahead.
And in that book, the book is about skepticism as a thing, and my favorite chapter in it is I'll go rough. I preface the whole thing by talking about about skepticism, about how we can be wrong, about the idea of truth and reality. And I've got this whole thing which I've talked about many, many times online about what truth is and what reality is. But it's very important again to understand that there are many different ways philosophically of assessing what truth and reality is. The presentation I give at the beginning of my book is what I believe, and I genuinely do believe this, is the best way of saying what reality is and what truth is in the context of that reality. And I think it's the best way to assess the world around us. And, I think there's like 2 chapters at the beginning which really go into detail in this and lay the foundation for the rest of the book. My favorite chapter in the book is my friend went to see a psychic medium. And her wife actually told me about it, and she said, I don't think she wants to tell you because she's afraid of how you're going to respond. But she actually went, and she came back and she said, well, that was interesting in a really not interesting way. And she's actually allowed me to transcribe. She recorded it, and she allowed me to transcribe the recording for my book. And what I've done with it is I've taken this whole visit. I've changed names and everything, so nobody knows who it is. But I've transcribed this whole visit and analysed everything the psychic is saying, and kind of gone into where she's asking leading questions, gone into where there's information she could have got from social media and things and got these answers, and gone into where she's cold reading. And that's I loved that process. It was by far the longest process that I did in writing a chapter of this book. But pertaining to the question, I know you said we didn't have long, Cara. I'm sorry. You shouldn't say that to me and expect me to speak.
30 seconds, and then we're wrapping up.
Yeah.
I got a gong here.
Okay,
and, we're going to send you off.
Pertaining to this talk in particular, yes, this book does deal with that psychological aspect of it. I think it's a really good argument against the resurrection. It's one I've not heard before. It's one I kind of chanced upon being interested in neurology and stuff. And I think it's a really good argument. That argument, the presentation I've given today, is based on that chapter of the book. So yeah, it will be in there.
I love it. And I am so looking forward to your book, and you're going to come back on and tell us about it when it's out. So we are going to look forward to that.
Yeah. So you'll have a fourth appearance so much. And a fifth appearance. Yes. And probably a sixth and seventh.
Yeah. So thank you. Thank you for your insights. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and all of the volunteers who help make this happen. We are going to continue on next week, same time, same channel. We're going to be talking a lot about building community. This coming month, we're going to have J Mike, we're going to have Secular Rarity, also returning guests from the ACA, as well as a few other new folks. So join us next week, same time, same channel. And don't forget, coming up in August, we have Rob trying to catch up with David Teachout's number of presentations. We'll be talking about, are humans actually special in the universe? So
I love
stick
the
around.
Rob versus David combat, duke it out thing we have going on.
Rivalry.
It is the best combat rivalry ever.
I love it. I love it. So stay tuned for that. And don't forget to follow us and like and subscribe and all that good stuff on the social medias. We are on Facebook. We have a main page as well as a Facebook support group page. We're on X, Instagram, and TikTok. And of course, we are on YouTube. Just search Recovering from Religion and you will find our channel, and you can watch all of the previous episodes, or most of the previous episodes of RfRx, as well as wherever you get your podcasts. And Helen, what can people do if they want to volunteer here?
Okay, y'all. At the beginning when I was talking about healing as one of the major things we do at RfR, one of the ways that you can find a heal is by helping others. I've been volunteering with Recovering from Religion. Will be 4 years in November, which is kind of mind-boggling when I think about it. But I have found so much purpose and love and support of being part of this organization. And it has been a big part of my life. And also, I know that there are many, many volunteers at RfR that I have not had any sort of contact with that are also doing this wonderful work that we do here. So I recommend that you fill out a volunteer application. And listen, y'all, it's like 4 hours a month. But if you're going to be hitting the rest of us, it's like Pringles. It's a Lay's, once you pop, it can't stop. It's Pringles. So once you pop, you can't stop doing stuff at Recovering from Religion, because we need people that can host support groups, supporting the online community and modding it, IT support, helping us with our any sort of online media with a website. If you want to be an agent, whatever, or if you are very familiar with Recovering from Religion, you're hey, I think you could use improvement in this, and I got some talents, you can do that too. So please consider filling out an application, become a part of this wonderful weird family that we are all a part of. And we are looking for web developers volunteer trainers, and support group leaders. Because again, we're always looking to add more support groups. So please have more support groups. Okay. Now that I said that, I'm going to hand it over to our wonderful executive director, Gail Jordan, to wrap us up for the evening and say goodnight. And from all of us at RfR, thank you for being here. This was really wonderful talk. And thank you, Richard, for being such an amazing human. So
thank you, Helen. And thank you everyone for attending tonight. Richard, you do it every time. You make us put our thinking caps on. Sometimes on RfRx, we have a rollicking good time, and those are awesome nights. And sometimes you make us think, you make us work for it, you make us process that. And I'm so grateful for it. Thank you for spending this time with us this evening. And those of you who have come, thank you for coming. Let me tag on one more thing to what Helen said about volunteering for recovering from religion. You don't have to be all the way there to be ready to volunteer. A great many of us who have come out of religious backgrounds, it's a lifetime's worth of work. Don't wait to be there before you reach a hand back. We would love to have your help. We would love to have you partner with us. We'll train you, we'll help you, and if the agent thing is not your thing, or the support group director is not your thing, as Helen mentioned, we've got lots of places of service. We have lots of tech needs. We have real specific needs in other areas, in social media and some other things. We have the entire fall excursion. What a segue into the fall excursion. In September, we have our annual religion recovery retreat weekend. It's the best time. If you haven't considered going, please do give it some thought, give it some consideration. Money, we had a big fundraiser this past spring, so don't let money keep you from coming. We have some subsidies available. You'll go to the Recovering from Religion website and click on the fall excursion page. You can see pictures of past fall excursions, and you can see what the schedule is, and you'll see a lot of familiar faces if you're able to attend. Thank you again for attending tonight. I hope you stay for the hangout. It's the best night of the week. I thank you for all those folks that have made this happen tonight and behind the scenes and put it in the podcast places and all those things. And Richard, especially thank you for presenting tonight. Have a wonderful evening.